talk explores the meanings and readings of Antarctic flags. And to introduce this talk, I'm going to have to transport you all to a tiny Antarctic island, because this is where I first became interested in Antarctic flags. So here we go. So the picture on the left here is a historic hut at a place called Port Lockroy, and this is in the Antarctic Peninsula region. And in this image, you can see there's a small colony of Antarctic gentooth penguins, and they're nesting around a flagpole which is flying the British Union Jack. At Port Lockroy, at the start of every summer season, there's quite some excitement around the ritual of raising this flag. The flagpole has to be carefully manoeuvred out of the building, and someone in the team is chosen to hoist the flag. The last time I was working there as base leader, we were a team of 4 women, and we were 3 British women and 1 Norwegian woman. So, as a nod to Roald Amundsen, we asked our Norwegian teammate if she would be willing to raise the British flag. And funnily enough, she was the only one in the team who actually knew which way round the flag had to be flown, which we all found quite amusing. So the symbolism of raising a national flag in Antarctica was never lost on me, and it made me very curious about the political, the cultural and the social functions of flags in Antarctica, both past and present. And I found it fascinating how visual artists have critically examined and represented Antarctic flags to offer some new interpretations of the Antarctic cultural space. So these are the origins of this morning's talk. Antarctic flags are key communication devices at all sites of human activity in Antarctica, and they're fascinating. Well, I find them fascinating because they're very diverse in their purposes and meanings. So I hope to be able to share just a few of these insights with you today. The material that I'll present is drawn from a number of sources, including Canterbury Museum's collection, and also some very recent acquisitions. Material held in polar, maritime science and military institutions, some examples of historic and contemporary Antarctic visual art, plus a couple of excerpts of Antarctic poetry thrown in there. Broadly, the talk is arranged into 4 themes, and those are national interest, site markers, personal emblems, and symbols of unity and subversion. I won't spend a lot of time covering the intricacies of the history of the development of flags, or go over ground which will no doubt be very familiar to historians, any historians in the room, but a few general points of historical interest are useful kind of background context to help explain how some of the flags have been used in Antarctica. So we first see the use of hand-carried standards in ancient Egypt and Chinese cultures. In European cultures, heraldry flourished in the high Middle Ages of the 12th century, and flags, pennants and crests were used to identify families and also political allegiance. Pennants and flags were most commonly used in combat and military contexts, on land and at sea, and securing a flag to a ship's mast during battle would signal to an opponent whose side you were on and your intention to fight to the death, hence the saying, nail your colours to the mast. Battles over territory, resources and power saw the creation of the first national flags, and just as an aside, the oldest national flag design that is still in use today is believed to be the Danish national flag. According to a 13th century legend, a ready-made flag floated down from the heavens into the hands of the Danish king, who was leading his troops into battle. In naval and other seafaring contexts, flags developed into an international communication system known as the Marine Code, which is still in use today. Writing in 1881 about the characteristics of flags in a book about their history and use, Andrew MacGeorge observes that it was only a bit of silk, having on it certain devices and inscriptions, a thing of no intrinsic value, which could be replaced at a cost merely nominal, but it possessed extrinsic qualities which could be measured in no money value. So here MacGeorge alludes to the often deeply symbolic ideas and messages in the visual language of flags, and equally important in the construction of meaning is how flags are used. So I'd like to start with this flag. And this is one that was made and flown by Australian geologist Douglas Mawson. So Mawson first worked in Antarctica under Ernest Shackleton's leadership on the Nimrod expedition. This was 1907 to 09. And he was in the group that were the first to ascend Mount Erebus, and he would later stage his own Antarctic expeditions. And one of those expeditions in 1929 was the British, Australian and New Zealand research expedition. Some of you might know that as the Banzar or the Banzari expedition. And for this expedition, he improvised a plain white flag shown here on screen using a cotton sheet. And he flew this from the foremast when leaving port, heading for Antarctic waters. So this flag was made as a courtesy ensign. And ordinarily, a courtesy ensign is the flag of the country whose waters the ship is visiting. It's flown as a mark of respect. Mawson's blank white flag, perhaps a reference to Antarctica's ice and snow, was his own acknowledgement of the continent and a recognition that the continent had no emblem of its own. So I'd like to suggest that this is perhaps the first Antarctic flag. There have been several since, and I'll come to those later in the talk. So this is a contemporary artwork by Australian artist Stephen Easter, and he alludes to a similar idea to that of Mawson's in this painting from 2003, which is called White Flag, brackets, James Cook. Now, some of you will know that Cook was the first to make a recorded crossing of the Antarctic Circle, and this was in search of a fabled southern continent, and he crossed the circle 3 times between 1773 and 1774, but he did not find land. So Stephen Easter, the artist, referenced Cook's search for land in this painting with hand-stitched red lines that track the routes of these 3 crossings, and each line you can see on screen falls short of the blank white flag that the artist has planted on the horizon. So my reading of this work is that the blank flag represents Antarctica as a then uncharted land and an unclaimed land. But this situation was to change in the 2 centuries following Cook's expedition. When islands and the continent of Antarctica were eventually sighted, flag planting began in earnest. The raising of flags and the naming of places supported Western European empire building. Landing ashore and planting a national flag and naming a space was part of a questionable ritual of claiming territory and sovereignty. Paintings by expedition artists and later photographs by expedition members would record these events, and these served as evidence of the claims being made. The painting showed on the left is a watercolour by John Edward Davis, and it depicts a shore party from the James Clark Ross expedition of 1841. And this shore party are naming and proclaiming sovereignty over Possession Island. And then on the right we have Douglas Mawson again, and his team are taking possession of Proclamation Island, which I think is a curious use of language of how those islands are named. Interior flag planting continued throughout the period of interior exploration, and photographs were often taken to record explorers staking their claims with their national flag. So on the top row here we see Shackleton and his team having reached a furthest south record. Then Douglas Mawson, again, with his team, they reached the geomagnetic South Pole. And in the team there, the flag that they're flying was an improvised flag. It was made by a man called Bernard Day, and he used pocket handkerchiefs to make this flag, hence the very attractive white polka dot design on the Union Jack there. So on the lower row, you see Roald Amundsen and team, who were the first to reach the South Pole. And the final image there is Robert Falcon Scott. He was also at the South Pole 5 weeks later after Amundsen. And despite being beaten to the pole, Scott did complete the ritual of raising the national flag. But rather than communicating that sense of achievement, the expression on Scott's face there betrays his sense of defeat. Edward Wilson, who was a member of Scott's Polar Party, carried other flags with him on the journey south. Christchurch woman Anne Hardy had asked him to carry a miniature Union Jack and a tiny New Zealand flag, and Canterbury Museum holds both of these, plus the exchange of letters between Anne and Wilson and Wilson's wife Oriana. The flags are very small, with one less than 10 centimetres in length, and you can think of these almost, they were intended as a kind of novelty souvenir in a way, but as it was, they became very poignant relics. They were recovered from the tent where Scott, Wilson and Bowers had died on their way back from the pole, just a few miles short of a food depot. The value of these flags as celebratory mementos has been overturned, and now they are symbols of tragedy. But these were not the only flags that Wilson carried south. He also carried a hand-stitched Norwegian flag, which would have been the first to be flown at the South Pole if Roald Amundsen had not arrived there 5 weeks earlier. When Scott was preparing for his second expedition, he visited renowned Arctic explorer Fridtjof Nansen in Norway. Nansen recommended to Scott that he use overland skiing techniques and dog sled teams for efficient travel. He also suggested that Scott take with him an overland ski expert when he recommended Trygve Gran. Following Nansen's advice, Scott did employ Gran, and he planned to include him in the South Pole Polar Party. A family friend of Gran's sewed this handmade flag for Gran to take on the South Pole journey. But when Scott and his team learned of Amundsen's plans to race to the South Pole, Gran asked Scott if he could be relieved from being part of the Polar Party because he didn't want to compete against a fellow countryman. And Scott agreed, so Gran asked Wilson if he would take this flag on the South Pole on his behalf. Well, as we know, Amundsen arrived at the pole 5 weeks before Scott, and he was carrying with him 12 Norwegian flags. These were flags that he'd taken with him on 2 Arctic expeditions, and after the South Pole, he also carried the same 12 flags when he flew over the North Pole. And the flag on the right here is one of these original 12, and both of these flags are recent acquisitions into Canterbury Museum's collection. So this story makes me wonder if Gran had been part of that polar party, would his skiing skills have got the team to the South Pole any quicker? And more importantly, would they have reached the food depot on the way back, and would they have survived? Gran was part of the search party who later found the tent with Scott, Wilson and Bowers inside where they had perished. And Gran helped recover the men's personal belongings, which included letters, diaries, journals, and the flags that Wilson had carried to the south. And these were returned to the owners or to the men's families. And the stories associated with these 2 flags have become part of their cultural fabric. Their value is in their entangled personal and political histories. They're the same national emblem, but one is a symbol of triumph and the other a symbol of defeat, prompting questions about what might have been. They represent the choices, decisions, and actions that led to their various expedition leaders' respective success and downfall. Another stage of securing a foothold in Antarctica was the building of expedition huts. The first ever building on the continent was built at Cape Adele, and here a team of 10 men undertook the first planned overwintering on the continent. This was 1898 to 1900, and the building still stands. This is a really interesting fact, it is the only example in the world of humanity's first building on any continent. Most of the team and the leader, Karsten Borchgrevink, were Norwegian, but the expedition sponsor was English, and this is why the team took a large stock of Union Jack flags with them on the voyage. So the image that you see here was taken on New Year's Day, and this is the turn of the century, 1900, and it shows 8 of the men sitting on the roof of the hut, which is lavishly decorated with Union Jack bunting, and a larger flag on a flagpole in the background. You see they're flying. And these flags represent the sponsor's nationality and the sponsor's interests. And noting not only the flags, but also the boxes of named products in the foreground there. So you could read this image as an early example of maybe product placement or brand promotion. 3 years after this image was recorded, the relief vessel to Scott's first Antarctic expedition visited Cape Adele, and they retrieved a large Union Jack. And this is the one that you see on the left here. This was gifted to Canterbury Museum by this expedition team. And it's still in excellent condition. This is a photograph taken just before the Antarctic Gallery was emptied for the recent decant. So it's in superb condition. 70 years later, after this flag was collected, a conservation team visited Cape Adele, and 19 more flags were retrieved and gifted to the museum. But you can see, there's 6 examples of those flags on the right, but you can see there that the rigours of the Antarctic environment have really taken their toll on the fabric. It's very badly deteriorated, extremely fragile and very fragmented, highly unstable. In the 20th century, as the value of Antarctic resources became more apparent and desirable, several nations competed to stake a claim and secure national interests. The artwork and title of Raewyn Atkinson's 2005 ceramics exhibition, Designs on Antarctica, cleverly alludes to the various economic, political and cultural enterprises that humans have pursued on the continent. This collection of work features transfers of historic imagery overlaid like labels onto slip-cast porcelain replicas of containers and vessels, which both symbolise modification and the consumption of Antarctica, and also reference the crates of foodstuffs that are still found in the historic huts. So pictured on the left is one of the Raewyn Atkinson's artworks, and this features the expedition motif of a 1938-39 German Antarctic expedition. And this is one of the lesser known episodes of Antarctic territorial geopolitics. And you'll see there on the image in the middle, the motif shows a map of Antarctica with a boundary drawn around an area called New Schwabenland, marked with a Nazi flag. So under the Nazi regime, this expedition conducted extensive air and ground surveys in an effort to secure territorial rights, and Nazi flags were planted along the coast, and they were dropped also from aircraft onto the ice. And a photograph of the Nazi flag being planted on the ice is used on the cover of Cornelia Ludecker's book about the history of this expedition, which you can see there on the right. Well, concerns about German and South American designs on Antarctica fueled fears fueled by fears of German and Argentinian relationships, prompted Britain to make concerted efforts to occupy space in the Antarctic Peninsula, and this was during the Second World War. So Port Lockroy, which is the place that I worked, I showed you the image right at the beginning, this was the first permanent British base established in Antarctica. This is in 1944, in the middle of the Second World War. And it was occupied year-round, flying a national flag until 1962. And the flag on the left is the one that was taken down the day that the base closed. It's now displayed inside that original base building. The base is now a museum that people visit. So the flag is exhibited within the museum. Well, Hope Bay, which is at the very northern tip of the Antarctic Peninsula mainland, was considered a strategic site by both the British and the Argentinian governments, and each of those countries competed to occupy the area. The Argentinian flag on the right, the British found flying when they landed ashore, so they took it down, replaced it with a Union Jack, and this was gifted to the Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge. Well, the tensions between the British and Argentinians in Hope Bay reached a peak 4 years later, when men at the Argentinian base fired shots at the British coming ashore. So these tensions created by overlapping territorial claims heightened the need for some kind of peaceful resolution, and this would take the form of the Antarctic Treaty in years to come. Well, by the end of that decade, actually. But throughout the 1950s, there was a heavily militaristic tone in much Antarctic culture and activity. In 1955, the US deployed their army, their navy, and their air force in what they termed an all-out assault on Antarctica. Operation Deep Freeze was staged partly to install the infrastructure for the International Geophysical Year research programme, also known as the IGY, and importantly, to install a permanent American presence on the ice. There were two artists that accompanied that first expedition, the Operation Deep Freeze expedition. It wasn't the first American expedition. So these two artists, Standish Backus and Robert Hone, accompanied Deep Freeze, and they recorded this episode of Antarctic history. The painting on the left shows military ranks on the ice saluting the US flag, and it reflects the nationalistic nature of the occupancy. The painting in the middle shows the flag prominent during the round-the-clock building programme. And then the painting on the right shows the flag central to even the smallest base camp. And together these paintings illustrate that the flag was both physically and ideologically at the centre of this military outpost. And this was reinforced by the saluting of the colours, the kind of ritual that happened every morning and every evening. Despite the overt nationalism and geopolitical strategizing, the IYG did herald a new chapter in Antarctic history, and this was based on international collaboration and cooperation in the name of scientific endeavour. The IYG provided a foundation for the negotiation of the Antarctic Treaty, and this was signed in America, Washington, DC, 1959, and it was signed by the 12 nations that were active in Antarctica at the time. The treaty is considered to be the world's most successful peace treaty. It dealt with those competing territorial claims by stating that the existing claims, they would not be recognised, but neither would they be disputed. If you like, those territorial claims were put on ice. And it also established Antarctica as a demilitarised zone. As a symbol of this historic event and signalling the international cooperation, the flags of those 12 signatory states are flown at the South Pole. And the image that you see below shows the flag bearers parading those flags to install them around the South Pole marker. And I think it's curious, just look at the order of the flags being marched there. So the pole, we know that Roald Amundsen got there first, followed by Scott, but it was the Americans that set up the Amundsen-Scott South Pole base. So here we see the Americans leading the way to the South Pole, followed by Norway and then the UK. In spite of the treaty, a fiercely nationalistic tone still pervades many Antarctic stations. The overt display of national flags has endured for over 120 years, since Cape Adele was first decorated with the Union Jack Bunting in 1900. And Orcada Station, featured here on this image, this station is one of the oldest in Antarctica. It was established in 1903 by a Scottish expedition, and the team did some groundbreaking meteorological recordings, and they offered the base to the British. The British turned it down, so they gave the base to Argentina, and Argentina have run the base ever since. So this station has the longest records of uninterrupted data collection in Antarctica. Historic claims of occupation, longevity of presence, and flag flying all go hand in hand in Antarctica. And the image on screen shows the station personnel lined up outside the station for a photo call with the national flag for a significant anniversary. But you will also notice in this image some other flags. Some of you, I'm sure, will recognise these. So these are the Marine Code flags that I mentioned at the very introduction. So they do have very specific meanings, but they also, each flag represents a letter of the alphabet. So when I saw this image, I thought, right, I'll decode this. There must be a secret message in there. And I'm extremely disappointed to tell you that no, there is no secret message. They haven't been arranged to spell a word. They serve as decoration only. But some designs, flag designs, are permanently painted directly onto station buildings. And these examples on screen are the aircraft hangar at Argentina's Esperanza station in Hope Bay. And then on the right, the Chilean Gabriela Gonzalez Videla station. And both of these stations are in that contested area of the Antarctic Peninsula that Argentina, Britain and Chile all maintain a territorial claim now. Domestic politics have also played out on the continent through the symbolism of flags. In 1997, South Africa unveiled their new station, Sane 4, and this was 3 years after Nelson Mandela had been elected. And this following excerpt from Lisa Marie van der Watt's work, titled The Whiteness of Antarctica, Race and South Africa's Antarctic History, explains how a design choice made an overtly political statement. She writes, "The building was, in the words of the first team leader to occupy the base, the biggest old South Africa flag ever constructed. The base sported the orange, white and blue stripes of the apartheid era flag. Officials tried to argue that the orange in particular was chosen for visibility. In retrospect, few denied that there was a political meaning behind the colours. No one wanted to disclose who took the final decision, despite warnings that the colours could be offensive. The colours were embedded within the fiberglass, and a special paint had to be sourced to provide a literal veneer of transparency. The Australian Antarctic personnel have thrown flags on the ice to show a commitment to reconciliation and race relations within their home nation. So the images on screen show the Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islands and Australian flags being flown at Casey Station to mark and support National Reconciliation Week. And flags also have a more utilitarian use. One of the most historically significant of Amundsen's South Pole flags was not a national flag at all. It was a repurposed food depot marker, and it was tied to an upturned sledge runner that he used to mark the South Pole. When Scott's party arrived at the South Pole, they found the marker, And Wilson made a small detailed pencil sketch, which you see on the right here. And this sketch epitomises Wilson's dedication to recording history. He must have been cold and exhausted, and he will have had to remove his gloves to draw and to write with this level of detail and precision. As we know what happened to the South Pole Party on their return journey, and the following year the search party found the flag and the sketch among Wilson's belongings inside the tent where he had died. And now Wilson's drawing takes on a kind of solemn poignancy with the knowledge that Scott and his team would have felt immense disappointment on finding Amundsen's black flag, and plus the fact that the men died on their return journey. Polar historian Bob Headland says that this small piece of black cloth is an ultimate tribute to the courage of man and the power of nature. Black flags are still used as markers today. American and New Zealand Antarctic programs use them to signal hazards in the ice, and this was the inspiration behind Claire Plug's textile artwork, Ice Crack, shown here on screen. And you just notice the dark fissure down the length of the work in the middle, and that's guarded by two black flags. And also notice her dyeing technique gives the cloth a very aged appearance. So Claire was very inspired by the historic textiles that she found in the historic huts, and the historic flags in Canterbury Museum's collection were also inspiration behind this work. Standish Bacchus, he was one of the artists with Operation Deep Freeze, I mentioned earlier. He painted and wrote about the ever-present risk of falling down a crevasse. And he writes, "On any part of the Antarctic continental glacier, a traveller lives under the Damoclean threat that a crevasse may be under him. Without warning, the snow that has bridged over the yawning moor, rendering it indistinguishable, may give way. Men and machines may be instantly swallowed for forever." So this is one of his paintings, which is called The Fatal Hazard. And Bacchus here records the tragic loss of one of the team down a crevasse. So you can see there are three men in the painting consoling one another, and also three flags that stand gravely, both marking the site of the accident, but also alerting others to the danger. In her poem Under Erebus, Bernadette Hall references a trail of flags across the ice indicating a crevasse-free zone. And the following excerpt complements perfectly Robert Hone's watercolour of a lone figure whose gaze follows a curve of red flags to a structure on the distant horizon. So Bernadette Hall writes, "See the red flag with its purple shadows, the flagged road curving towards tomorrow. There is shelter here, off to the right, a bunch of metal rods and a cloth. You wonder if it's going to be enough." So both the poem and the painting represent a sense of human vulnerability pitched against nature. Hall's flags lead to a tent, which seems flimsy against the elements, and Hone's flags are a handrail, a kind of safety handrail across the featureless white ice. Todd Anderson, another visual artist, explores the same idea in his artwork titled Waypoint Flags, but the viewer must look really hard to spot those flags. So in this work, Anderson has stressed the sheer vastness of the ice and heightened a sense of isolation and vulnerability by depicting the green trail flags as barely visible on the horizon. In a photographic artwork by Graham Sidney, he documented a stream of red flags across a deserted ice-scape. And this image is a perfect accompaniment to one of Owen Marshall's snow poems, simply titled Flags. And in the last line of Marshall's poem, he describes Antarctic marker flags as a minor but defiant intrusion on a world of black and white, as if a gala has been set up, but no people have yet come. So I've mentioned black flags and green markers and red marker flags. If I was to ask you to guess what kind of site a yellow flag might mark, I wonder what your answer would be. Well, we would find the answer in Anne Noble's photographic artwork. So 15 years ago, Anne Noble documented authorised outdoor urination sites in the US Antarctic program. And you'll see in the centre of this image stands a bright yellow flag in a puddle of yellow-brown stained snow. And the scene is surrounded by immaculate white snow, which visually creates a tension between the ideas of purity and contamination. And the work draws attention to the questions of human presence and our impact on the Antarctic environment. And coincidentally, a yellow flag, if it's flown on a ship, signals there's a disease on board, which I thought was an interesting coincidence. Other flags on the ice have much greater significance and meaning as personal emblems. The most recent emblems of identity and solidarity in Antarctic communities are flags representing inclusion and diversity. Pride has been celebrated in Antarctica for the past few years, and the first same-sex marriage took place on a British base, Rotherham Station, as recently as last year in 2022. The first Pride rainbow flag was unfurled at the US McMurdo Station, and this was in 2018. And just as a point of interest, it was taken south by a man called Evan Townsend. And later that same season, Townsend turned his hand to designing an Antarctic flag of his own, which we'll come to later in the talk. In the days of Scott and Shackleton, personal identity was stitched into the fabric of each man's sledging flag. And this was a conscious revitalisation of medieval heraldry. Most of these pennant-shaped flags had a St George cross at the hoist, and Barbara Tomlinson, curator at the UK's National Maritime Museum, explains this was to denote that whatever family the bearer may belong to, he is first and foremost an Englishman. The sledging flags epitomise MacGeorge's observations that we see represented in flags the idea of divine duty and heroic daring. Ernest Shackleton's family crest is made up of a golden flag with 3 buckles on a red stripe and a yellow cross on red canton. And interestingly, the men would often raise these sledging flags when they stopped to take a break and have some food. So, the men would often raise their sledging flags when they stopped to take a break, have some food. So it's a very fitting coincidence, I feel, that in the Marine Code, a yellow cross on red, when raised at sea, means that a ship is replenishing. I thought that was a nice coincidence again, and I'm sure unintentional. An example of a sledging pennant with a direct connection to Aotearoa, New Zealand, is Louis Benaki's flag, made for his time with Scott's Discovery Expedition. Benaki was born in Belgium but grew up in Australia, and he was a member of Borchgrevink's Southern Cross Expedition and was part of the team that overwintered at Cape Adare. And then he was recruited by Scott for Scott's first expedition at very short notice, and he joined the ship in Lyttelton, and his sledging pennant was made for him here in Aotearoa, and he describes this in a letter to his brother. He writes, "A lady here is making me the most beautiful silk sledging flag, 4 foot long. At the base, the navy flag with white and red cross, and the other part, dark blue with the constellation of the Southern Cross. In the centre, underneath, a Maori motto, meaning seek, seek, and ye shall find. I trust it will fly over the magnetic pole and further south than hitherto attained." In his hometown of Hobart, stay on this slide. In his hometown of Hobart, a monument to Benaki has been sculpted by the artist Stephen Walker, and it shows him holding this pennant aloft, and you can make out that the sculptor has captured the detail of that embroidered design and the motto on the surface of the bronze. As symbols of individual identity, sledging pennants would be hung together to decorate the expedition hut during significant occasions such as special dinners, and especially the midwinter dinner. Not only did the flags help create a celebratory atmosphere, but they signified being part of a team. These occasions would boost morale and foster a sense of togetherness and group identity. A significant feature of most of these sledging pennants was that they were often handmade by wives, mothers and sisters. And Barbara Tomlinson explains that this tradition harked back to an age of chivalry in which ladies embroidered tokens for their favoured knights. And a wall tidy handmade by young women of St Hilda's School in Dunedin and gifted to Lieutenant Edward or Teddy Evans, second in command of Scott's Terra Nova expedition, is an example of one of these hand-broidered tokens. So it represents very personal connections that link Aotearoa New Zealand with the UK through Antarctica. So the item, which is designed to hang on a wall, it has pockets for storing small items, is embroidered with a British flag and a New Zealand flag. And these sort of signify the connection between the British expedition and New Zealand as a gateway south. And more importantly, the flags signify the marriage of Evans to Christchurch woman Hilda Russell, who was a former pupil of St Hilda's School in Dunedin. So the pair met when Evans was second officer of Scott's first Antarctic expedition, and they visited St Hilda's School together shortly after their wedding. And the pupils had a real affection for this couple, and it inspired them to create this wall tidy for Evans to take with him south. As you can see in the photograph, which was taken by Herbert Ponting, some of you may recognise that name as an Antarctic photographer, the wall tidy was well used in the expedition hut, and it was kept as a souvenir after the expedition. Following the loss of Scott and the South Pole Party, Evans became the expedition leader, but he was to suffer another devastation. He returned to New Zealand, and he and his wife set sail for the UK. But Hilda died en route, and she never made it to the UK. But the wall tidy was always a treasured memento. Evans did remarry, interestingly, to a Norwegian woman, and this wall tidy hung in their family home, in their family kitchen for years. Then it passed down the family line and then was purchased by Canterbury Museum. So this is another of our recent acquisitions. So flags and other sewn items, such as this wall tidy, were ways that women were represented and their presence was felt in Antarctica, even though it would be the second half of the 20th century before women worked in Antarctica in their own right. Margaret Bradshaw, Christchurch-based geologist and former natural history curator at Canterbury Museum, was one of these pioneering women. So I'm sure many of you know that in the 1970s, Margaret was the first New Zealand woman to lead a deep field science event in Antarctica. And on screen is the sledging pennant from one of Margaret's later geology expeditions. A unique emblem this is a kind of unique emblem of scientific endeavour. The flag features the name of the expedition and a representation of the extinct fish species, and Margaret was there to collect these fossils. And now I'd like to just move to the final section of the talk, which takes a shift in direction to look at how the flag form has been appropriated for political messages. For some artists, the powerful symbolism of flags can be used to interrogate, critique, subvert and disrupt political narratives. So on screen, you see a work by Winston Chmielewski, and this work is called Melting as a Model, That's All. And this was commissioned for an event called the Antarctic Biennale, which was presented in Venice in 2017. And to make this work, Chmielewski stitched together national flags of the Antarctic Treaty signatory states, and then he cut away their substance, leaving only thin borders with the connecting seams intact. And the body of each flag appears to have fallen and left discarded on the floor. So although materially flimsy, the borders are intact and they are symbolic. So they are the only substance holding the remnants of these flags together. So to me, this work suggests the idea of maintenance of geographical and political borders and boundaries, and the extremely fragile appearance of this work is suggestive of the fragility of global politics. So the artist explains that the work represents fissures in the international cooperation on the ice in the face of environmental impacts. And the seams are each stitched with political dialogue, and they trace what the artist describes as a cacophony of global divisions. So while Chmielewski erased the substance of the flags, leaving only borders, in their work Antarctica Flag, the artists Lucy and Jorge Orta, they do the exact opposite. So they've taken the emblems of national flags and they've blended the borders between them. And these symbols of nationalism, they merge into each other to create one complete image. Antarctica Flag was originally commissioned and installed in Antarctica in 2007, and these flags have been flown across the world at major cultural events to complement UN environmental talks, with the aim of attracting public attention, public scrutiny, and public pressure. So in this and their other artworks in the Antarctic series, the artists have reimagined Antarctica as a symbolic utopia and a sanctuary for climate refugees. They argue that Antarctica's extreme climate imposes mutual aid and solidarity and collaboration for the good of the planet. So in this context, the Antarctica flag is a symbol of unity, and they suggest it should become a flag of the new world community to be raised as a supranational emblem of human rights. So you remember the name Evan Townsend, who took the Pride flag south? Well, later in the season, he designed his own Antarctic flag. And this flag is called the True South flag, designed in 2018 when Evan was overwintering in Antarctica. And it shares some of the same aims as Orta's Antarctica flag. Townsend describes that it was created to actively build community and connection with Antarctica. The design is comprised of two horizontal stripes, one navy and one white, and these represent Antarctica's half year of darkness, half year of daylight, and in the centre there's a single peak representing Antarctic icebergs, mountains and pressure ridges, and this peak casts a shadow which creates the shape of a compass arrow pointing south. So together, the peak and compass form a diamond shape in the centre, and for Evan, this symbolises the hope that Antarctica will continue to be a place of peace, discovery, and cooperation for generations to come. Townsend explains, through my work in international education, I've learnt a lot about nation branding and how it can affect public perception and multilateral policies. So that's helped with designing the True South flag. For Townsend, the flag is a symbol around which the international global community can coalesce. And now for our final flag of the presentation is by a Spanish artist, Santiago Sierra, whose flag also, he also desires that the global community coalesce around an Antarctic flag. But for Sierra, his flag is a political emblem of a movement which calls for revolutionary change. This is the black flag of anarchism and it's the ultimate anti-flag. So in an article titled Anarchy at the South Pole, Santiago Sierra plants the black flag to destroy all borders. The artist explains, flags, national anthems, and all of that garbage comply with a despicable ideology that defines people in the same way as a red-hot branding iron defines livestock. The black flag is a flag of all of us who don't identify with the flag or don't want to have a flag. So his project is simply called Black Flag, and the artist orchestrated the planting of two identical flags, one in the geographic North Pole, one in the geographic South. And this was completed almost 10 years ago in 2015. But the artwork and its message are increasingly relevant and urgent. So interestingly, his flag in the South was planted on the anniversary of Amundsen being the first person to reach the South Pole. And in those 100 years since Amundsen's achievement, Antarctic ice cores have revealed undeniable correlations between the rise of industrialisation and global capitalism with changes in the Earth's climate that in time are likely to make the planet uninhabitable for human life. Sierra's project is a symbolic gesture of rebellion against the capitalist system, which emphasises the need for transformation of a global economic and political structure. So it's a highly political and provocative Antarctic flag that brings me to the end of the presentation, but I'd just like to leave you with an observation, if I may. So I opened the talk with a white flag and I've closed with a black one. And interestingly, both of these, in their different ways, symbolise or call for a rejection or an absence of national claims to Antarctica. And this seems fitting in a way, considering the global influence of the continent. Antarctica's ice is central to the creation and maintenance of an Earth system which currently sustains human life, and the consequences of its melting will not respect national boundaries or national interests. So thank you for listening.